welcome to another episode of Latitude. I'm Maruf Raza. Joe Biden is the first American vice president to visit India in 3 decades. But the big question, was he here to improve ties or simply to do damage control? To discuss Indo-U.S. relations, we will be joined by Ashley Tellis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a former U.S. State Department official, a long-standing observer of Indo-U.S. relations, and the author of India's Emerging Nuclear Posture. Later in the show, to discuss the implications of drone attacks and the future of drone warfare, we will be joined by Dr. Stephen Bucci of the Heritage Foundation, a former U.S. Special Forces officer who's also served in the Pentagon. In keeping with President Barack Obama's vision of Indo-U.S. relations being the defining partnership of the 21st century, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden's well-orchestrated visit to India has left little room for pessimism.
He is the second in command in America, and he left no stone unturned to charm New Delhi during his maiden visit to India as the U.S. Vice President. A 4-day visit with a view to bolster trade between the two nations after Obama called U.S. relations with India a defining partnership of the century ahead. While the United States wants a friendly investment climate in India, New Delhi wants an immigration policy that will make it easier for highly skilled Indian workers to enter the American job market. And during his India visit, Joe Biden stressed, convinced and reiterated how India has only to gain with a stronger partnership with the U.S.
We mean what we say when we say that this relationship between India and the United States has unlimited potential. And there is no reason why trade, commerce, and intercourse between our countries can't increase exponentially.
The Joe Biden visit was all about trying to show that all is well between the two countries, when in reality it highlighted the strain between New Delhi and Washington, as also the areas that both sides have to work on.
The challenge is that for India and the US, both of us are going through a period of economic difficulty. So the question is, how do we find ways to expand the economic cooperation between the two countries? Indians have some grievances like on the H-1B visas. We want shale gas from the United States. The US wants Indian market to be opened up. India and US had done this historic nuclear agreement in 2005. Now, the implementing that agreement still has some wrinkles. For example, the commercial negotiations between Westinghouse and the Nuclear Power Corporation of India are still going on. So the Americans would like to see an early closure of this agreement.
At a time when Afghanistan has become one of the top focuses, the debate is about how to handle the 2014 troop withdrawal and maintain peace and stability in the region. Joe Biden is one of the ardent supporters of a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, along with an Islamabad-brokered peace deal with Taliban. But a wary India, afraid of the Taliban resurgence post the United States troops withdrawal, wants to give Afghanistan enough support to resist the extremists.
India doesn't want that security vacuum, because inevitably that vacuum will be occupied by the Pakistan-aided, abetted, sponsored militants, the Taliban. India's options boil down to ensuring that these inimical elements that are inimical to Afghanistan's well-being, prosperity, stability are not allowed a foothold.
Rebalancing in the Asia-Pacific is also a US priority, and the China puzzle is something that both India and the United States try to figure and counter. But should Indo-US ties be based on China?
The question is, how do you deal with the rising Chinese power? Is there something India and US can do something together? Now, when we talk about India-US cooperation in Asia, that's not about containing China, because China is too big. Nobody's going to be able to contain China. Second, this is not about making India a junior partner to the United States, because India is also too big to fit into anybody's pocket. So the question is, how do you structure a stable balance of power in Asia And there I think the question is, can we work together?
Meanwhile, the United States perhaps is looking at India to balance the power equation in Asia, with China increasingly threatening to dominate. A goal shared by New Delhi and Washington alike. Thus, Joe Biden's visit will indeed go a long way in consolidating progress and restoring political trust between the two nations.
America's vice president has said all the right things about India after a visit that was clearly aimed to energize Indo-U.S. relations. But there are issues that need to be still addressed. And we have with us Ashley Tellis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a long-standing observer on Indo-U.S. relations. Mr. Tellis, Joe Biden's visit comes at a time when a number of American companies continue to whine about lack of market access to India, and whereas officials in India continue to say that the U.S. has done little to stop the terror machinery that operates in Pakistan.
I don't think that's quite the case. This visit had been planned for many months, and it was only scheduling that accounted for the Vice President's visit at this time. The issues that he engaged India on go way beyond the specific complaints that American companies may have about the current business environment. So I think it limits the visit unduly to treat it as simply an exercise in damage limitation.
There are many in India who are unsure what really the U.S. could do to support India in the event if relations between India and China on the border issue become worse, or there is tension once again between India and Pakistan, like there was after the Parliament attack and the 26/11 attacks on Mumbai.
I think soon, if you look at the historical records, soon after the attack on Parliament, there was a spasm of American attention on Pakistan's activities with respect to terrorism. And that pressure that the United States brought to bear in Islamabad really lasted for the better part of the last decade. Of course, the U.S. had to walk a fine line, because even as Pakistan was conducting its own subconventional war against India, it was also an ally of the United States in the campaign in Afghanistan. But even given that fact, the United States put tremendous pressure on Pakistan, first on General Musharraf and then later on his successors, to really pull back on the kind of support for terrorism. And, you know, the record also shows that the Pakistanis did comply, though a little slower than we would have liked.
India has invested a lot of resources, time and energy in rebuilding Afghanistan. But many in India are disappointed that the United States is talking to the same Pakistan-backed Taliban which has wreaked havoc in Afghanistan in the past. And if the U.S. does finally settle for an arrangement with the Taliban, where does that leave India in Afghanistan?
Well, there are several dimensions to this question. First, the U.S. is very clear that it will continue to welcome India's investment in Afghanistan. That investment is good for the Afghan people, and the government of Afghanistan has welcomed India's presence and will continue to welcome India's presence as long as this regime in Afghanistan survives. The second point to remember is that the United States is just beginning a conversation with the Taliban. There is no assurance that this conversation will succeed. And if it does succeed, it will succeed only if the Taliban accept the three conditions that Vice President Biden has reiterated are essential for success. If the Taliban actually commit to those three conditions and abide by those commitments, then that is an outcome that is good for the Afghans and is good for India as well. So I don't see that as necessarily being to India's disadvantage.
In your view, what has really hindered a deeper strategic alliance between New Delhi and Washington? There has been the next steps in strategic partnership, the NSSP, and you've yourself been the architect of the Indo-U.S. civil nuclear deal. So what can be done next to move this relationship to the next level?
I think the great transformation that has to take place is the transformation that takes place outside of government. Governments have to create policy frameworks that allow the private sector in both countries to essentially deal with one another. The big work that still needs to be completed is the policy change, primarily in India, but also to a lesser degree in the United States, that will allow the American and Indian private sectors to get on with the business of doing business. And I think this is where there has been some disappointment in the last 2 years in the United States about the pace of reform in India. But if that pace picks up, as the government of India has promised, then I think both sides will be in a position to really realize the gains that they have long worked towards.
American leaders like Joe Biden have said that there are few countries in the world that have more in common than India and the U.S. But then why have relations between India and the U.S. failed to take off time and again?
I think the answer is actually in the question. We are excessively alike. The kinds of forces that paralyze decision making in both our governments are very similar. And so the fact remains that we are two democracies that have to navigate not only vis-a-vis each other, but also vis-a-vis ourselves. And that is a challenging and sometimes uphill task. But I see the long-term trends as moving in only one direction. Both countries are fated to be closer partners of each other.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Tellis. Clearly, there is a lot of room for optimism if we go by what you have to say on Indo-U.S. relations. Welcome back. Despite drone strikes by the United States on suspected terrorist targets having taken more lives of civilians and innocents, President Barack Obama is adamant that drone strikes will continue. The big question is, what, if at all, will be the rules of engagement of this modern weapon of warfare?
और ये रोज-रोज का जो सिलसिला है जो ड्रोन्स के अटैक का ये सिलसिला ये बंद होना चाहिए.
This was the current Pakistani establishment's clear stand on the deadly drones even as they were assuming power. Because the toll on civilians is a heavy price that Pakistan has to pay. A heavy casualty that the U.S. continues to deny.
Much of the criticism about drone strikes, both here at home and abroad, understandably centers on reports of civilian casualties. There's a wide gap between U.S. assessments of such casualties and non-governmental reports.
But the U.S. now stands exposed. A recent leak of a 12-page classified Pakistani government report has revealed, for the first time, the country's evaluation of the CIA drone campaign. The report rubbishes U.S. claims that only 50 to 60 civilians have died in strikes over the 9-year history of the program. The details of attacks by NATO forces report categorically states that between the years 2006 and 2009, 75 drone strikes were carried out, killing 746 people, of which at least 147 are said to be civilians, including 94 children.
This government has laid a great deal of emphasis on registering our viewpoint with the United States government and the world at large that the drone strikes violate our sovereignty, violate international law, are counterproductive, entail human rights implications, have humanitarian consequences.
Despite widespread opposition from within Pakistan, the drone attacks continue. Only recently killing 17 suspected militants in Pakistan's tribal areas, an attack the Pakistan Foreign Ministry called counterproductive.
the official document has also been saying that the actual number of civilians killed is higher. The Tellis estimates the total number of civilian casualties at somewhere between 411 and 890, a count higher than the Pak records. But the team Obama seems to be unaffected by it, going to the extent of dismissing its own courts to review decisions on drone strikes.
With an unapologetic US taking the lead, India now is following suit, with an eye on both the western and eastern fronts with Pakistan and China. Even the Indian armed forces are slowly but steadily building a formidable arsenal of spy, target acquisition and killer drones or UAVs.
We've been using UAVs definitely so far, but we have not used the killer version of it or the combat version of the UAVs so far. For surveillance, intercollection and other such peacetime kind of tasks that are given to UAVs, we have been using them, and we do have a reasonably elaborate plan to bring in these UAVs both on the western and also on the eastern front.
With parameters for drone use remaining undefined, the onus lies on the sovereign nations themselves to use lethal force with responsibility. While it is a known fact that civilian deaths occur and will continue to occur in the war on terror, unlike the United States, India should adopt a policy that is transparent and reveals the true extent of casualty.
Following the American example, it is now apparent that the Indian armed forces are also planning to induct drones and UAVs. And with us on the show is Dr. Stephen Bucci, a former U.S. Special Forces officer, now with the Heritage Foundation, to answer questions on drones and their future use. Dr. Bucci, President Obama has made it known that drone strikes will continue. And there is a comment in the Guardian newspaper which says that the U.S. would rather kill with drones than have prisoners put in Cuban prison camps. Your views?
Well, the people that they're going after with the unmanned aerial vehicles are people that would not be terribly easy to go and arrest and to confine. People that are picked up, say, inside Afghanistan are not killed with drones. We do pick them up and try and capture them if we can do it and incarcerate them. In this case, they're still incarcerating them in Afghanistan. But if they are in an area that is not accessible to us with ground forces, then we do have the option to use airstrikes of whatever sort we prefer. In this case, we're using the unmanned aerial vehicles.
A former Obama aide, John Brennan, has said that the U.S. is planning to move away from CIA-led drone attacks, which gives a certain degree of secrecy and anonymity to the CIA, to military-led drone attacks, which would have greater transparency. Do you feel that's going to happen, and is it going to make a difference?
Frankly, it's impossible to eliminate collateral damage, regardless of what weapon system you use. Despite all of our best efforts to minimize collateral damage, when you use military technology, very little of it is as surgical as we like to portray it in our rhetoric. So there is no way to eliminate that collateral damage. You can only do your best effort to minimize it.
Drones could be the new favorite weapon of the armed forces the world over. But somebody has to define their rules and how they should be used. And while Mr. Obama is keen to do that, he seems to have used drones, up to now at least, as his signature message in a foreign policy which critics regard as extremely reckless.
I don't know if it's reckless policy. As we've said at Heritage before, we think this administration has overused unmanned aerial vehicles as sort of a panacea for their policy. I think it's perfectly legitimate to use an unmanned aerial vehicle in the same way you would use a manned aircraft. There's really very little difference other than where the pilot sits. In one, he sits inside the aircraft. In the other, he sits in a remote site controlling it. These are not autonomous robots that fly out and make their own decisions. They are essentially piloted. They're just not piloted from inside the aircraft. So in that regard, the rules of war that exist for any airstrike should also exist for the use of unmanned aerial vehicles. You don't need a separate set of rules because the pilot isn't sitting in the aircraft.
Until now, the U.S. has largely used drones on suspected terrorists and terror groups. But there is a view that after the U.S. withdraws from the AFPAC region, drones are likely to be used the world over for gathering intelligence and surveillance. Do you see that happening, and how?
Well, actually, they've used the unmanned aerial vehicles far more for surveillance than they have for strikes. The number of strikes compared to surveillance is quite great on the side of the surveillance. The Predator drone, for instance, was designed to be a surveillance aircraft, was used for surveillance as early as 1994, where we used it, flew out of the country of Albania over the horizon into Bosnia during that war. So they've been used for surveillance far more frequently than for strikes. So returning to that predominance or continuing that predominance now once we move out of that particular theater won't really be an exception.
Thank you, Dr. Bucci, for your insights. And it's very clear that drones are now the real weapon of choice for the developed countries and their armed forces. And in the case of U.S., it gives the Americans Zeus-like power to hit out at their enemies at will, anytime, anywhere. Apparently, President Obama also has a secret kill list. With that, we come to an end of this episode of Latitude. Thank you for being with us, and goodbye.